Today, I have a special guest joining us. This is a faculty member who I've worked with for a very long time, actually since I was in high school. Dr. George Daniels is an associate professor at the University of Alabama in journalism and creative media. He and I have worked together both in a teaching capacity and research capacity. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of respecting diversity in your writing for media. So welcome, Dr. Daniels. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. Thank you for thanks for coming on and speaking to our students. I know they're going to enjoy hearing your perspectives. So why don't you start out first by telling us a little bit about your professional experience and then a little bit about your academic experience.
Sure. I had an opportunity when I was in high school to work at my high school newspaper and actually produce stories for the daily newspaper. And that's how I got connected to media over 30 years ago now. But after I finished high school, I went on to college and completed a degree in news editorial journalism, Howard University. But then I had an internship my senior year at my hometown afternoon newspaper. It was a great internship, but I decided I didn't really want to work in newspapers full time. It was fun. It was great to write for the weekly newspaper, but television was where my heart really was at that time, and to some extent still is. I'm a broadcast journalist. So my first job out of school was working as a producer on the weekend news. And very soon after that job, I moved into doing radio news on a business radio station in my hometown of Richmond, Virginia. And then from there, I only worked there about 18 months. And then I got my next job in the NBC affiliate in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then after 2 years there, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where I worked for most of my career, about 5 years on and off. And producers, of course, are responsible for managing a newscast, from the conceptualization of what do we want to have in the show, what stories you want to air, how long of the story is going to be, to the process of getting all of the video collected, the introductions written, the story scripts written, all of that process until it goes on the air and until the anchor says goodbye. You're in charge of that newscast. And so I did that for really about 8 years of my life, and then moved from there to graduate school at the University of Georgia, the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication. And then in 2003, I landed here in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama.
That's wonderful. So tell our students a little bit about some of your academic research and the importance that the portrayal of diverse community plays in news writing.
Well, one of the things that I identified very early is, even when I was in graduate school, the importance of having different voices in messages that we produce in the news media. And when I was in a master's class, I started doing interviews with editors about the importance of having people from different racial groups in their daily newspapers. I traveled all over the state of Georgia completing that research. And I continue to do that kind of work even as a student at the PhD level. And one of my first research presentations was on the presence of women in local television. And we actually analyzed hundreds of reports on hiring at local television stations. And from that research, we learned that it's not just about who is working at that station, but what kind of impact those workers can have on the content of the stories, the broadcasts that are produced. And so we talk about diversity as it relates to your product representing the people who are in your audience. If you're in a community that is in Alabama, are people from Alabama represented on your newscast, in your newspaper, on your website? Because the whole idea of mass media, of mass communication, is producing information for an audience. And so you want your audience to see themselves in the content that you're producing. And so that is really a challenge that we have, because we come from so many different places, and the tendency is to always make the content based on what we're used to doing and seeing and the folks we're around, depending on who we are. And unfortunately, often the we doesn't reflect the people who are in that community or in that audience. And so we have to be very intentional about making sure that we, one, know who our audience is, and then that we are reflecting that audience in every message that we produce, whether it is a 10-minute news update or a 2-hour documentary, whether it's an entertainment program or a news-oriented program. The message that we produce, we want that message to reflect those who are in our audience so they can see themselves in the product, and hopefully they'll continue to watch, they'll continue to read, they'll respond to that message.
And I really like how you put that news is really a product of, and it's meant to be reflective of the audiences that we are trying to connect with. So in thinking about that, it moves the talk of diversity away from just making sure that the proper words are used or making sure to use proper terms, and really talks about the entire product of news reflecting diversity. So what are some tips you have for beginning journalists, both in writing and in the production of the entire product of news, in making sure that it properly reflects all communities?
Well, one of the things we want to think about is when we're developing our writing and we're thinking about the message, that every news story or press release or commercial script or radio broadcast script is a message, and there is a goal in sending out that message. It may be to inform, it could be to entertain, it could be to get you to show up for an event. But when you look at that message, are you reflecting the people in that message who you're trying to reach? So let's say, for an example, I want to get people to buy hamburgers at my restaurant. Now, if I want young people and older people and people in between, if I want women and men, I want to make sure that that strategic message, that commercial in this case, reflects the people who I want to come and buy the hamburgers at my restaurant. If I'm trying to deliver a strategic message that might be about some upcoming event, I want to make sure that in that news release that I have information that is going to appeal to those who I want to come to that event, whether it is to cover the event, if they're a news operation, and we know that news operation really caters to younger people or people in a particular political group. I want to make sure that I craft that message with that audience in mind. Specifically, when we talk about news, we're also thinking about telling the full story. And that full story always has more than one view or vantage point. So when you develop that story from who are my sources going to be to what is my angle going to be, I want to think about who the audience is for that news story. And it doesn't have to be a story about a particular racial minority group or a particular gendered minority group. Often when we talk about diversity, we think about those who are left out. But sometimes it's how we talk about those who are left in that reflects diversity and difference. So I think when I start with my story, I want to identify my sources based on reflecting a range of views and vantage points. I also want to make sure that in telling that story that I have the right visuals that are going to convey the message that is very complete. We always want our story to be complete. And when we are identifying our sources, when we're thinking about our story and our visuals, we also want to leave the viewer with something that he or she didn't already know. And so that goes to, what is the part of the story that people probably are least familiar with? That's what you want to focus on. That's what makes that story most newsworthy. Yes, I would expect that if we're talking about the COVID-19 coronavirus and students who are going to entertainment after hours and what that does to the rate of infections of the COVID-19 virus, then I'm going to have college students in my story. But what about the 60-year-old woman who is 5 years from retirement and is not necessarily staying at home, whose routine is impacted by these students who are now back for college? What is her experience, or that 60-year-old man's experience? That might be a voice, a vantage point on this COVID-19 story that I need to include in my story. So it starts with conceptualization. It then continues to planning. And then after we do the story, we need to also ask, did I tell the full story? Was there something I left out? Is there an opportunity for me to follow up? Those are the kind of things that have to be a part of our everyday development of our products, our news product, our message.
Yeah, I really like the idea of trying to step outside your current experience and your current frame of mind to intentionally seek out alternative points of view. And that can certainly be from a racial perspective, a gendered perspective, or even as you're, say, a member of the disabled community or elderly community. So it's really about trying to step outside what you currently know. And as you and I know from teaching journalism many years, something that can be challenging for introductory students is that level of discomfort as you step away from things that you're used to. So how can we help our students, and what can our students learn about being able to step outside of what they know and trying to get new experiences within their stories?
Well, it's really important, Professor Devers, for us to be uncomfortable. That when you are telling a story, you're going to have to ask that question that is not comfortable. You're going to have to make that call and make that request to someone who might say no, who might ask, why are you asking me that question? That's okay. When you make that call, when you make that request, be prepared to be turned down and be ready to respond and say, wait a minute, what if I just asked you this? Would you be willing to talk to me? It's not just contacting someone for an interview. It's also about going out and gathering information in an area that you might not be familiar with. The beauty of being a journalist, I think, is expanding your horizons. But I often find when students are starting out that that expansion is the most difficult part of the reporting process, because I don't know what this person might say. I'm not very familiar with this subject. I don't really know this community. I'm afraid that I might say something stupid. All of these are things that happen when you're starting out. But if you go in with the mindset that I'm going to be uncomfortable, so let me get the most challenging part of this out of the way by making that phone call, sending that email, maybe even practicing my questions that I might ask in an interview with a friend, and let that friend tell me, now, did this sound like I had confidence in myself when I asked that? Did that question sound really clear? The other thing that I would suggest is, when you're researching a story, sometimes it's not about getting an interview, it's about reading things that you wouldn't otherwise read. So when you're doing your background research, going to websites that you wouldn't often read or review, pulling publications that you might not otherwise review, just to give you some different perspectives that would inform and expand and really deepen the work that you're doing as a reporter, as a news gatherer.
Yeah, I like the comfort with the uncomfortable. That is some great advice for our students for sure. Now, in thinking about current events and everything that's going on with our nation, particularly in terms of racial issues, you know, I know a lot of our students feel like they don't know how to make a difference. They don't know what is the right thing, how they can speak and really make a difference. Why does it matter that we as media professionals are writing in a way that is reflective of all communities? What kind of impact does a greater appreciation and awareness of diversity have for media writing and culture and society as a whole?
I think one of the things we've learned in the recent events, especially this summer with many of the protests and even those that are continuing at the time of this interview, is the media, the news media, play a critical role in getting the word out about these types of things when they happen. We are uncovering, we're exposing, we're providing context, we're providing viewpoints that people might not otherwise understand. In the month of June, for the first time, there was a number of cities holding what were called Juneteenth celebrations. Well, I would guess, I would say I'm certain actually, that there were thousands of Americans who didn't know what Juneteenth was, but now they know what it is and why it's celebrated. And that particular celebration that has to do with when people of color, African Americans now, at the time that African Americans were enslaved Africans, were informed that they're free, that it took years for that word to get out. And while the Emancipation Proclamation may have been signed in January of one year, it took years for that word to get to everyone else. And you have a June time when everyone else found out about it. Well, Juneteenth is one activity that the media brought more attention to, but not just brought attention to. The messages that we know about many of the incidents regarding the police, what government is doing about it, how elected officials are responding, and those who have decided to protest, why they're protesting, how they're protesting, all of those messages have to be captured and shared. And that's what we play a role in, a major role in as journalists. So no matter what part of communication you are playing, whether it is as a journalist, as a film producer, as a public relations practitioner, as an advertising account executive, you are responding to the current environment and you have a level of power and influence in that role. So it behooves every one of us who are in this role to be informed, to be willing to go into an area with which we're not comfortable, and at the same time recognize that our messages can have impact, sometimes instantaneously. When we post it to a Twitter feed, when we send it out on a website, people respond in seconds. And all of a sudden, there's a conversation around the message that we put out there. So it needs to be, what, accurate. It needs to also reflect a message that we can stand behind. That means we're accountable for our message. But also it needs to minimize harm and recognize that with such a very challenging issue like race, the potential for harm is there. But that shouldn't scare us away. It just means we have to embrace the impact that we can have and go for it. Tell that story, interview a person who has a concern, but also recognize that sometimes we may have a personal opinion and we have to know how to tell that story, but also recognize it's our sources who we're featuring, not ourselves in our message. So those are some things to keep in mind as we're responding to some of the events that are happening in our world.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great range of advice. You know, we have the ability as media writers and media professionals to do harm, as we've seen with inaccurate portrayals of racial communities as well as gendered stereotypes. But we also have such a great power and responsibility to make change in our society for good. And I'm so glad that you kind of focused on both of those aspects, as well as providing excellent advice on accuracy, sourcing, and overcoming personal bias. Those are all great things to consider as we consider diversity being represented within our writing. So Dr. Daniels, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Do you have any final advice for students?
Get out there and go for it. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. You can always make a correction. Recognize the power that you have and continue to do the work because it is so important.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Have a great day. And students, I will see you in our next video.